On the seventh day of creation, God rested. This is a concept that's pretty much glossed over by most Christians, but it's vitally important to understanding who God is, his methodology, and how and why he interacts with us the way he does. In fact, I would go as far as to say that if you don't understand the seventh day rest of God, you will not understand the entire Bible. It's that vitally important. And we will talk about it on this week's episode of Genesis, Back to the Beginning on Faith by Reason. Welcome to Faith by Reason. The website behind it all is faithbyreason.net. There you will find hundreds of hours of study material, blogs, podcasts, and videos. And I also highly recommend you join my Patreon by going to patreon.com/faithbyreason. And by becoming a Patreon, you get to see these episodes first because everything goes onto my Patreon first. In addition to being a patron and getting these episodes early, you also get bonus material that will never be available on my free feeds. You also get access to the Q&As where you ask questions and I will answer them every week on a separate video. You get my books and other products at a discount. And if you level up to the next tier, you get all of these. Plus, you will also get all my books for free that I'll be writing in this year and throughout and in the future. And you also be a part of my Bible study, my private Bible study, where we go through the entire Bible in 1 year, once a month. Then we take it from the spiritual standpoint, the supernatural point of view, which is 80% of the Bible. So if you are in a Bible study that is not focused on the spiritual aspect of the Bible, then you are missing most of it. And it's the main reason why most people don't understand the Bible. So it's a special study, it's private, and it's only for my tier 2 Patreons. Okay, enough for the self-promotion. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, in this episode, we are going to basically be finishing up the creation narrative with just a few short verses. We'll be talking about the seventh day of creation, the day that God rested. So far, we've talked about who God is, his nature, why he created the universe the way he did, the spiritual and physical realms. Then he created the angels. There was the angelic rebellion, and God decided to do a recreation, a replenishment of the earth. And we talked about that in the last episode. And of course, there have been bonus episodes about angels. And I did just the last bonus episode was on some mysteries of creation. And now we're going to wrap it up with the seventh day. So let's just start by reading those first three verses of Genesis chapter 2. And here we go. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. And that's all we're going to be going over in this episode. It is vitally important to understand this. I know it's only a few verses, and frankly, it's a few verses that most Christians don't spend much time on. We take it for granted. We kind of trivialize it, unless you're a Seventh day Adventist, and then you take it way more seriously than you should. I'm kidding there, but I'll talk about that at the end of the episode, why the whole Sabbath thing is such a big deal for them and why it's a big deal for us as well, but not anywhere near the same way as those folk do it. Okay, on the seventh day, God rested. Cool. Then we get into Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and all that, which is also incredibly important for understanding God's will and his methodology and what he wants from us, why he created humanity in the first place. But that's for the next episode. But we need to spend some time on the seventh day and that seventh day rest, because if you understand that, then you will understand God's methodology, why he does things the way he does, and why he doesn't do some of the things that we think we want him to do. It also help us understand how to interact with him and the way he interacts with us. Again, so this is important. So let's understand what it means when we say God rested. And let's first just dismiss the kind of colloquial and a little infantile idea that God rested because he was tired. No, God was not tired. When he said he rested from all his work, it wasn't because it was such a hard lift for him. And he was like, oh, whew, that was tough, speaking the world into existence and separating the waters and speaking animals and plants and trees and whatnot into existence. No, that's not what this means. Let's back up and put this passage into context, because even though it's in chapter 2, the three verses that I just read should actually be a part of chapter 1. It should be part of the poem. Remember, we talked about this the last few episodes, that Genesis chapter 1 is a poem. It is a big picture overview of creation. We talked about this in the creation introduction. And that poem doesn't end at the end of chapter one. It ends three chapters into chapter two. Why did it do that? Well, let's keep in mind that the chapter and verse breaks in the Bible are not inspired. They did not come from God or any of the other prophets and apostles who wrote the books of the Bible. They were added in over 1,000 years later, in fact, 2,000 years later in some cases, from the original book. And they were put in by us human beings in order to make the Bible easier to read, to break it up into more digestible chunks. And they do a good job for the most part, but because it was done by humans, it wasn't perfect. So there are some times where a chapter begins too late or ends too early or vice versa. And this is one of those cases. Chapter one ended too early. Chapter one should have ended where Genesis chapter two, verse three ends because it's part of the same poem. All 6 days should be in the same part. So that's why I'm just going to do this part today and get into because verse four of chapter two is where chapter two should start because chapter two is the exposition, the expansion of the poetry in chapter one. Remember, in Hebrew poetry, you have a poem that gives a big picture overview, which will be either preceded by or followed by extrapolation. And the rest of chapter two from verse four on is that extrapolation. Okay, so with that out of the way, what does it mean that God rested? Again, it wasn't because he was tired. God does not have muscles like we do. He doesn't get muscle fatigue. He doesn't have lactic acid buildup. It wasn't mentally or physically exhausting for him to create the universe. No, what that word rested from his work means, it means that he ceased his activity. He ceased his work. He rested from all the work he had done. So let's look at what these words mean in the actual Hebrew. And this is why it's so important and I talked about this and when I did a bonus episode on what type of Bibles we should use, because I get that question all the time. What Bible should we use? Should we use the King James or the New King James or the NIV or the Contemporary English? And I said the most important thing is to have a good interlinear source. That an interlinear Bible takes every word and lets you look it up in the original language. And frankly, we have no excuse to not do that these days with the internet because if you can go on to a site like Blue Letter Bible, which is the one I use, where you can look up every single word quickly online, tap on the word, it will tell you exactly what it means in the original language. So we are without excuse for not understanding this. I mean, back in the day when I was growing up, I was in my 20s before there was an internet. Yeah, I know I'm old. But back then, when I wanted to look up a word, I had to use a concordance. I had to use, some type of tome. In fact, I have one right with me right here. Hold on a second. I have this, the Complete Word Study Old Testament. This is a book where you open it up and it has all of the verses. You probably can't see them very well here, but above every verse is the number of the word, and then you have to go to the back of this book and look it up. So that's how I had to do it. And this book was actually this is an old book. I got it as a teenager. My dad gave it to me as one of my birthday gifts when I was a teenager, which probably tells you a lot about my childhood and why I've needed therapy. I'm kidding. My dad's great. I love him to death. But anyway, it was a lot of work to do that. Now it's just a couple of clicks on a mouse. So go and use interlinear Bibles when you are doing your study. So the word for rested is the word Sabbath, where we get the word Sabbath, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it means to cease activity. That's what it means. It means to cease. And to cease what activity? He ceased from activity from his work. What does work mean? That word work in the Bible means occupation. Exactly what you would think it would mean. So God ended, he ceased his occupation. What was his occupation in the first chapter up until now? It was creating unilaterally. It was unilaterally implementing his will. Before Genesis chapter 2, God did everything because he wanted to do it. He decided, he said, I want a spiritual realm and a physical realm. So he made the heavens and the earth. He said, he said, I want intelligent beings to be a part of this creation. So he created the angels. Then, of course, the angels rebelled and he had to judge that rebellion and restart again. Then he said, I will bring light back into the world. I will separate the waters from the waters with a firmament. I will create dry land. I will have dry land appear. I will create vegetation. I will create the sun, moon, and stars. I will create sea life. I will create birds. I will create land animals. I will create humanity. And then I will rest. So all those I wills. Interesting that saying I will is an act of implementing your will, obviously, and unilaterally doing so. There's another entity who said a whole bunch of I wills, but he got in trouble for it. We're going to talk about that in a second. He's the entity we call Satan or Lucifer, Halal bin Shakar. So in the first chapter of Genesis, God unilaterally implements his will without any discussion with anyone else, without any counsel. He just did it unilaterally. This is the last time he does this until we get to the end of Revelation, where he makes a new heaven and a new earth. So for 99% of the Bible, God is not initiating his will. After Genesis chapter 2, the only thing God does is he responds to what humanity does and what the fallen angels do. He only responds. He does not act. And if you understand that, then you understand all of the interactions that God has with us and with the fallen spiritual evil for the rest of the Bible. And it also addresses one of the issues that people have about why God does things the way he does. If you talk to someone who is not a believer and you ask them, what is your hesitation? What is your issue with God? And most of them will tell you, well, if God is good and he's all powerful, why is there evil? If God is a God of love, why is there evil in the world? And this actually reminds me of a quick story about a conversation I had with an atheist because atheists love asking this question. Atheists are funny to me because they claim not to believe in God, yet that's all they ever want to talk about is God. They define themselves by their fight against the entity that they claim doesn't even exist. And by the way, after we're done with Genesis chapter 2, which we're going to wrap up next time, we finish up with Adam and Eve in Eden. I'm going to do a couple of episodes on evolution, giving the counterpoint. And I'm going to end it with my gift to atheists, where I'm actually going to resolve their issue. Because with atheists, it's not an issue of logic. So don't get into a logical argument with an atheist. It's not logical to fight against something that you don't believe exists. No, atheists have a mental health issue. And I'm going to help them with that. Logic does not help with mental health. You have to get to the core. And I'm going to help atheists get to the root of their issue, and it will help them. Maybe not in the way they want, but it'll be helpful. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, in this story, I was in my 20s and I was smart, but I wasn't wise as I am today in my elderly years. I'm not an elder, I'm middle age. But so I was smart, but not very wise. And I was at a party and it was very, very nice party in this, huge house that a friend of mine had that was overlooking the ocean. I don't know if you're familiar with Southern California. It was in the Palos Verdes Hills, just gorgeous area, but neither here nor there. I'm just reminiscing. But there were a lot of people at the party, and I'm walking around with a beer in my hand, checking things out, and I hear a commotion. I'm over in one corner of the house, and it turns out there's this guy, it's this atheist holding court there, just railing against God and the Bible and how the Bible is wrong and Christians are stupid and how could you possibly believe this? And I just kind of faded into the background. I didn't want to be a part of it. Not because I didn't think I could confront him successfully. No, atheists are easy to defeat because their beliefs are so irrational and so based in falsehoods and frankly fears that it's not a big deal to take them down in an argument. But as I said before, logic doesn't work with them. I don't waste my time with atheists, and I just didn't feel like it. But unfortunately, somebody saw me standing there and they knew me and they said, "Hey, well, Ed's a Christian." And as soon as this guy hears that, he just walks over to me and strides purposefully to my area and says, "Are you a Christian?" I say, "Yes, I'm a Christian." Okay, I have a question for you. I have a question. I will destroy your Christianity. I'm like, I sincerely doubt that. Many have tried before. I'm guessing if anyone gets destroyed, it won't be me, but go ahead since I'm here. You have until I finish my beer to ask your question. So he said, okay, well, here's my question for you. Oh, okay. Do you believe that God is a God of love? Okay, well, this is what's called a setup question. What he wanted me to do was say, yes, God's a God of love. And then he would have responded with, well, if he's a God of love, why is there evil in the world? Blah, blah, blah. Heard it a million times. So I decided to throw a wrench into the works. He says, do you believe that God is a God of love? I said, no, actually, I don't. Of course, that stunned him because he was ready for me to say yes, as most Christians would. And so he said, what, you don't think your God is a God of love? I said, absolutely not. Because when you ask about someone, and you say, what are they of? You're asking about their nature. God's nature is not love. God's nature is that he's always and completely right and just. That is the cause of God. An effect of being always and completely right and just is that he is love. But that's not his nature. That's an effect of his nature. So I said, so let me ask you a question. What is love? And of course, he wasn't ready for that because, most people don't have definitions for these concepts they put out. And so he said something along the lines of, well, love is when you have, positive, beneficial emotions or thoughts about someone. I said, great. That's your definition of love. So do you love your mother? I said, yeah. Okay. Do you love your siblings? Yeah. Do you love your girlfriend? Yeah, I love her. Well, he had to say that because his girlfriend was there at the party. And I said, okay, great. Have you ever been angry with them? Have you ever had a fight with any of them? He said, yeah. I said, okay, well then you've just proven that you lied because you don't love them. Because you said before that love is a benevolent feeling you have towards someone, and you've also just admitted that you've been angry with all these people you claim to love. Therefore, by your own definition, you don't really love them. And that shut him up for a minute. So I was able to educate the people around me, which, was my point. Again, not him. He was a lost cause, as most atheists are, if you confront them logically. I said, the definition of love is giving without the expectation of getting anything in return. That is the definition of love. And that's the kind of love that God has. Okay, so great. Now we've established that, Mr. Atheist. What was the question you had for me that was going to destroy my faith? And he kind of backed off after that because his whole his whole argument was based on me answering his questions the way he thought I would, and I didn't, and that took care of that, and I got to finish my beer. Anyway, the, the point of that is that people have this incorrect definition of the way God should react if God was a loving God and if he had our best interests at heart. And that idea, that misconception is based on their lack of understanding of what it means that when he said he rested. God does not unilaterally implement his will. He cannot and will not act on us before we do something wrong or right. So God will not stop evil before it happens. He can't do that. If he did that, that would be violating his own precept, his own concept that he rested. This is why God doesn't stop bad things from happening before they happen. Even horrific things, wars, genocide, sex trafficking, harming children. It's not because he wants these things to happen. It's not because he's indifferent to them. It's not because he doesn't care. It's because he's resting now. He's in a state of no longer initiating his will. He can only respond, meaning that he cannot stop evil before it happens, but he can judge evil after it happens, which unfortunately means that the evil has to happen first before he judges it. And that's what people don't get. And that's why they claim that God is indifferent for not preemptively striking against evil. He can't do that. So why would God limit himself this way if you want to consider it a limitation? He did it for us. You see, God sees his activity of being a first cause of initiating his will. He gave that responsibility and that right to us, to humanity. We're going to talk about that more in the next episode, but just understand that he told Adam and Eve, this world is yours. You are to rule it the way you want. And then I'm going to, at the end of the day, we can walk and talk. And again, we'll get into that in the next couple episodes. But he gave that unilateral will, that ability to be the first cause to humanity. Why would he do that? Why does he do that? It's because he wants to, because God does not like being a dictator. And so this is why it's so important to understand God's nature, because we have this wrong idea about him that God is just this guy who just does whatever he wants, whenever he wants to do it. He does things because he's sovereign and he can just do what he wants. That's not how God operates. Yes, God is sovereign, but so are we. And he gave that sovereignty over to us because that's what he wants to do. God has no desire to initiate his will. He loves sharing his authority. That is clear throughout the Bible. God has a council of angels. We see that in the book of I believe it's in the First Kings, where we see when he is ready to judge Ahab, he has an angelic council and he says it's time for Ahab to be judged because he's done wrong, so God can respond to him in justice. But even though God is able to respond now through justice, he still says, hey, angels, what do you guys think? And they give him some ideas, and one of them he has an idea that God approves of, and God says, go ahead and do it. God loves sharing authority. He is the opposite of a dictator. And I know this because there's only two places in the Bible where he initiates his will. We just talked about chapter 1 and at the very end of Revelation, where he creates a new heavens and a new earth. And then after that, he stops initiating his will again and he spends eternity just hanging out with us. God does not want to do a bunch of stuff. He wants to hang out. He wants fellowship. He doesn't want to lord over people. He doesn't want to be a king over people. God does not want that. He just wants to hang out with us, share stories with us, and just be cool. That he wants to chill out with us. That's what God wants. He wants to interact with us. He doesn't want to tell us what to do. He doesn't want to make us do anything. He wants to interact with us. He wants our thoughts. He wants to know our stories. That's the true God. And unfortunately, it's a travesty that we have this idea of him that is just the complete opposite of who he is. But if you don't understand the seventh day rest, then you're going to believe these fallacies that God is this dictator on a cloud, again, unilaterally implementing his will without any regard to what we think or what anyone else thinks. No, what God does is respond through justice. Justice means things have to equal out. So if we do something, and it's not just, justice being judged in a negative way, it's positive too. If we do something really good, God can interact with us by rewarding us because we do something good. Great. God can equal out justice by doing something good for us, and that equals things out. And of course, if we do something bad, well, then God can do something bad back to us, again, to even things out. That's what justice is. So when we do good, good things can happen to us. When we do bad, God can do bad things to us. That's that's how he does it. That's how he interacts with us. And that is the only way he interacts with us and with the fallen angels. That's why evil is allowed to happen because he can't justly judge evil or good until it's done. So God can't bless you with $1 million unless there's a just reason to give it to you. So those of you who are praying, oh God, give me $1 million, make me rich. God says, okay, well, how can I do that justly? What justice have you accrued that will allow me to justly pay you back by giving you $1 million? If you don't have $1 million worth of value, God can't give you $1 million because that would be unjust. But also, God's not going to unilaterally take your money from you if you haven't done anything wrong. Now, if you've cheated somebody out of $1 million, well, God can take $1 million from you to equal out that justice. But if you haven't, then he can't do anything because he only responds. So if you understand that, then you will understand the rest of the Bible. If you put everything that God does, all of his interactions with humanity and with the fallen angels from chapter 2 all the way to the end, if you look at that through the lens of how is God responding based on justice, then you will finally understand him. And that's vitally, vitally important. So if you're watching some TV preacher, and I don't recommend you watch any of them because most of them are heretics, but if you watch some of them and these faith preachers who say, if you just believe hard enough, you're going to wake up one morning and there'll be a check for $5,000 in your mailbox. They are lying to you. They're either lying to you directly, which probably are, or they're ignorant of what God's methodology is, which I think that's the case. I think they're both deceptive and ignorant. That's not going to happen unless you have enough value for God to give you that $5,000 or whatever the amount of money you think you're going to wake up and have in your mailbox, because it would be unjust if you haven't done something that gives you that enough value for God to give it to you. Not going to happen. And if that's what you're praying for, you need to change your prayers. And you need to know who God is better, which is why you should join my Bible study and you'll understand it that way. Okay, so let's touch on the angelic aspect of which I was talking about a little earlier with Lucifer and all the I wills. So God no longer says I will. He doesn't initiate his will. And the good angels don't either. They seem to be mirroring what God is doing. They only respond as well. They don't do their own will. The good angels, the ones who didn't fall, are only doing God's will, meaning that they're going to respond the same way he responds. They're only going to do what God tells them to do. They don't initiate their will. Because you see, angels are called ministering spirits. What is a minister? Well, don't think about your local pastor, and I'm not trying to disparage whoever your pastor might be, but in general, most pastors who call themselves ministers aren't really ministering. A minister is a servant. If you are ministering to someone, you are serving them. Most people pastors who call themselves ministers are just the opposite. They're being served by everyone. They're the good reverend doctor, whoever, and you're supposed to put them up on a pedestal and give them money, pay them to be over your church and, hold them in this high regard. That's not their job. A minister is a servant. A minister is supposed to be looking after the needs of everyone else. So if you are a true minister of a church, and hopefully whoever the minister of your church is has that mentality, he should be saying every day, what can I do for my congregation? How can I help them? How can I be there for them? How can I meet their needs? That's what a true minister does. And again, hopefully whichever church you go to, you have a minister like that. But again, that's not how a lot of them act, unfortunately. But angels are ministering spirits. The fallen angels are the opposite. They do their own will, just like Satan said, or Lucifer said, the Halal bin Shakar, Lucifer, son of the morning. He said in Isaiah, I will ascend to the heights of the cloud. I will be over the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. He had all those I wills. He's saying, I'm initiating my will unilaterally. And of course, that led to sin. The fallen angels in Genesis chapter 6, which we'll get to down the road a bit, they said, I will go down and cohabitate with women to create the Nephilim. Every time the angels say, I will, they fall. So there is something about initiating your will in defiance to God that leads to sin. Adam and Eve said, I will eat the forbidden fruit when God told them not to. So I think there's a kernel of truth there as far as how we should behave. Because if you're responding to people, you're probably not going to sin. You're not going to sin. You're going to be just because you're going to be responding to them in proportion. So we should consider that in our everyday lives. Are you responding or are you initiating your will? And which one is more likely to get you in trouble? So I'll just leave you to think about that. All right, let's wrap up this episode by talking about how and why God blessed and sanctified the seventh day. He instituted basically the Sabbath, because I said that word rested is the word Sabbath, which is where the word Sabbath comes from. He blessed it and sanctified it because it was important to him for what he wants, which we're going to start talking about in the next episode. His whole will for his new creation, and that was for them to take over, for humanity, for Adam and Eve to rule over the world. And then he would get to interact with them and hang out with them. That's what he wants to do. That's his will. And that's why he sanctified it, because that seventh day is a memorial of him saying, I'm going to get what I want now. I'm going to be able to interact with my creation, and which is the will of God. Now and of course, when we get to the era of the law, God commands the Israelites to sanctify the Sabbath, the seventh day, again as a memorial, so that they know every week when they take the time off on the Sabbath, they are emulating God and they're ceasing from their activities, and they're supposed to cease from their activities and focus on what God has done for them, and focus on their responsibility, focus on the fact that they are now the first cause, that humanity is now the ones who are initiating our will, and we're supposed to do that in accordance with what God wants for us. So that's the point of it. And I want to get quickly into the idea of, should we celebrate the Sabbath? Should we obey the Sabbath? I talked about this a little bit in one of the Q&As on from my Patreon, but I just want to talk about this now because you have a group of people called the Seventh-day Adventists who essentially say that if you don't obey the Sabbath, you are sinning. Is that correct? No, it's not. Look, if you want to obey the Sabbath, go right ahead. If you want to observe the Sabbath and not do anything on a Saturday, fine. It's not a sin if you do, but it's not a sin if you don't. How do we know that? Because this came up in the book of Acts and the Council of Jerusalem when Christianity was just starting, and the first Christians were Jews. They were proselytizing each other throughout Israel, because Jesus did come to, he's the Jewish Messiah. That was, he came to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. Paul talks about this as well in Romans. But after the first 10 years of Christianity, Gentiles began to come into the church. God basically told Peter, go out and witness to the Gentiles. And Paul became the main apostle to the Gentiles. So now Gentiles were coming into the church, and they weren't obeying the law because the law wasn't given to them. So there was a contention among the Jewish leadership about whether or not a Gentile had to obey the law in order to be a Christian. And the Council of Jerusalem, under the auspices of James, the half brother of Jesus, they all agreed that there were only two parts of the law that Christians had to obey in order to be saved. And that was, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, which is an act of idolatry, worshiping false gods, and no fornication. And fornication is not sex before marriage. We've talked about this many times. I'm not going to get into it. Fornication is a sexual act as part of spiritual worship. Okay, it's not sex before marriage. There's no such thing. Sex is marriage. Sex seals a marriage covenant. So there's only two types of non-spiritual sex you can have: marriage or adultery. When the first person you have sex with, you married them. Anyone you have sex with outside of that, without ending the marriage covenant, is adultery. Fornication means not having sex as part of idolatry. So basically, what they're saying is, don't worship other gods. That will be the only thing that will preclude you from being a Christian. Why? Because if you have another God, before the God of the Bible, then you can't be a Christian. So that's all. It does not say anything about the Sabbath or tithing, which is why, and we don't sacrifice animals anymore. We don't have to be, a woman is not ritually unclean during her menstrual cycle. If you have leprosy, you don't need to bathe in the river. You can eat shellfish and pork if you want. The only thing you have to do is not put any other God before Jehovah, which is the first of the Ten Commandments. Can keep from, that's how you can remain saved and be saved. You can still sin and be saved because Jesus died for our sins, the sins we committed yesterday and the sins we're going to commit tomorrow and a year from now. There is no sin that Jesus cannot forgive. The only sin that cannot be forgiven is if you reject him in favor of another God. So clearly, if you have another God before him, then you can't be saved. So obeying the Sabbath or observing the Sabbath, do it if you want to, but you don't have to. It is not a sin. So sorry to the Seventh-day Adventists who are watching. You're wrong about that, about it being a sin. Like, you're not wrong for observing it if you want to observe it, whatever, but you are wrong for telling other people that we are sinning for not doing it because you are in violation of what the Bible said. Sorry to burst your bubble. All right, so we can wrap this up now. In the next episode, we're going to get to the creation of Adam and Eve, who were the first humans created. There was no pre-Adamic civilization. I've talked about this before. I did a bonus episode where I did a deep dive on why the pre-Adamic civilization, not only does it not make sense, it actually violates the Bible. It makes the Bible wrong in many places, but we will see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, that if you believe in a pre-Adamic civilization, then you're admitting that the Bible contradicts itself because the Bible makes it very clear in chapter 2, verse 5, that there were no humans on the earth before Adam and Eve. And you can read it for yourself, but we'll take a deeper dive into that. So we'll talk about Adam and Eve, the purpose of humanity, God's will for humanity. We'll talk about what Eden was like. And I may do another bonus episode after that, getting into the mysteries of Eden, and we'll talk about Adam's so-called first wife, Lilith or Sophia, which is utter nonsense, but I'll address it. But we'll spend most of our time in that bonus episode really helping you understand what Eden was all about and why that is God's will. Okay. All right. So thank you for listening and watching. I appreciate it. Go to faithbyreason.net for more info. I highly recommend and really encourage you to join my Patreon at patreon.com/faithbyreason, where you get first access to all these episodes and the Q&As and bonus episodes. And you can also be a part of my monthly Bible study, and you get all my materials either free or at a discount. So please do that. And until then, I will see you next time when we get into Eden.